Lesson 49. The 14th Amendment and Due Process and Civil Rights. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. In this landmark case, NAACP lawyers will argue successfully that separate but equal is a constitutional violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. 58 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court reversed separate but equal. In the Brown case, the court ruled that separate but equal violated the 14th Amendment's principle of equal protection under the law. This is probably the most important Supreme Court case of the last half century. What is the background of the case? The plaintiff was Oliver L. Brown, a parent, a welder, an assistant pastor at his local church, and an African American. His daughter, Linda, a third grader, had to walk 6 blocks to her school bus stop to ride to Monroe Elementary, which was a segregated school, while Sumner Elementary, a white school, was 7 blocks from her house, so 1 additional block was a white school, Sumner Elementary. She had to walk 6 blocks to get on the bus to go to a segregated school, but 1 more block she would have been at Sumner Elementary, which was a white school. Monroe Elementary, National Historic Site, 1982. Sumner Elementary, National Historic Site, 1992 for Monroe. And then Sumner, 1987. These are landmarks today because this, again, was a very dramatic, consequential Supreme Court ruling. It changed the face of American history. Brown versus Board of Education. You see the Brown family, Oliver Brown and little Linda Brown. This was actually a class action case directed by the NAACP. In other words, 13 parents each attempted to enroll their children in the closest neighborhood school in the fall of 1951. And each of those parents were refused enrollment and directed to the segregated school. NAACP lawyers argued the case before the court, including Thurgood Marshall, who's in the center of that picture. He will later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Nine nothing was the ruling by the Warren Court that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson was a 7-1 ruling in favor of separate but equal, in favor of legalizing segregation, as long as people had equal access to the same facilities. But now, in the Warren Court, 9-0 in the other way. Who was Earl Warren? Former 3-term governor of California, former vice presidential nominee on the ticket with Thomas Dewey in 1948, nominated by President Eisenhower in 1953, retired in 1969. Earl Warren. The next few years, Warren led the court in a series of liberal decisions that revolutionized the role of the court. Eisenhower later remarked that his appointment of Warren was his nominee. Remember, he nominated Warren, didn't appoint him. Supreme Court justices are nominated and then confirmed by the Senate. The biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. Warren led the court to landmark decisions throughout the 1960s that extended individual rights, the rights of the accused, and forced the government to justify any attempts to infringe upon such rights. The Warren Court introduced the concept of one man, one vote, limited the scope of police searches, extended the right of counsel to accused felons, even if they were unable to pay, and recognized the fundamental right of privacy. Wow. Warren Court. Throughout the South, billboards proclaimed, "Impeach Earl Warren." "Save America. Impeach Earl Warren." "Save our republic. Impeach Earl Warren." Wanted for impeachment, Earl Warren. Earl Warren wrote the controversial Brown opinion from the very famous Brown ruling. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. Now notice, if you can remember, the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling said that just because you're segregating the races doesn't denote, to use Warren's term, one race as inferior. Now, Earl Warren is saying, yes, when you segregate by race, that is denoting the inferiority, in this case, of the Negro group. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Deliberating Brown. Plessy was poopy. Catchy, Earl, but how about separate but equal isn't equal? In other words, separate but equal violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The very fact of segregation marks the segregated race as inferior. High Court bans segregation in the public schools. There's little Linda Brown. Look at how the little white students looking at Linda Brown as if she were an alien. The Brown decision came in two parts. Part one, the court had to consider if segregation was constitutional. Part two, after ruling it was not, the court had to decide what to do about it. So, the following term, the court heard arguments about what to do about it. The court determined that segregation should be ended as soon as possible, but it recognized it would be difficult for communities to deal with the change. Many were institutional, political, and the social circumstances had to be worked out. So the court struggled how to phrase the order to desegregate schools and what kind of time frames should be attached to the order. So in other words, once, the South had been desegregated for over 50 years. Had been segregated for over 50 years. You just cannot desegregate or integrate in a short period of time. It's not going to work, not going to happen. This was the phrase that Earl Warren chose as a timetable for desegregation. Very famous phrase. With all deliberate speed. With all deliberate speed. In other words, okay, schools, and not just schools, all public accommodations, all public facilities had to desegregate or integrate with all deliberate speed. So what does that mean? If we take a look at the word deliberate as an adjective, it's carefully weighed or considered, studied. 2, characterized by deliberation, careful or slow in deciding. 3, leisurely and steady in movement or action, slow and uneven, unhurried. So the schools had to integrate, but beyond that, the court's decision was extended to all public accommodations, not just schools, but railroad cars, restaurants, hotels, bathrooms, water fountains, etc. The Brown case created a crisis in nation-state relations and helped spur the civil rights movement. The decision initiated a social revolution supported by major national civil rights legislation. Many southern states did not want to integrate. Like race mixing is communism. Stop the race mixing. Keep Birmingham schools white. Oh, Birmingham, Alabama. Oh, Alabama has a big election coming up on Tuesday. Alabama. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Alabama Governor George Wallace, his inauguration address, 1963. Wow, we got a problem here, don't we? There's George Wallace standing in front of a school. We had John F. Kennedy sending in National Guard troops to make sure that, no, you are going to desegregate. You are going to integrate. Lester Maddox, yes, it is Maddox, not Maddox. Lester Maddox was the governor of Georgia from 1967 1971. He said, "That's part of American greatness, is discrimination. Yes, sir. Inequality, I think, breeds freedom and gives man an opportunity." Students, this was the governor of a southern state from 1967 to 1971, saying that discrimination is part of American greatness, that inequality breeds freedom and gives man an opportunity. This is the governor of a United States. The presence of segregation is the absence of democracy. Jim Crow must go. Support the merchants who support segregation. In other words, go to those businesses that segregate. Support those people who refuse to sell their goods and services to African Americans. Look at the anger in the women's faces behind the black student here. Look at the anger. Look at the hate. The civil rights movement. We'll stop right here. In lesson 50, we'll take a look at this civil rights movement and the ongoing challenges in civil rights and equal protection.